Well, good morning, church family. Happy Father's Day, everybody in the audience. So delighted you are here this morning. Thank you, Lynn, for leading our communion thoughts earlier. Thank you, Lee, for leading our worship. I didn't hear exactly what Andy was saying. I was messing around with the storybook in the back, so I'm not exactly sure what went down during the announcement time, but I suppose I'm grateful for whatever that was. A few months ago, I was invited by one of our missionaries, Mislav Ilic, to come to Croatia and give a series of talks to a missionary retreat there. There was, not missionary retreat, there was about 60 people from 6 countries over there, and they were coming together in Croatia. And Mislav asked me to prepare a few talks about what does it mean to follow Jesus. And so I written my talks and brought them with me, and I got over there, and I learned a few things at the beginning of that conference that made me think carefully through what I was going to say. So the first thing I learned is that there were 7 Ukrainians which had fled their homes because of the war, and they were homesick, and they had no idea when they would go back. The second thing I learned is that 2 of these people had lost family members in the war. So one of these ladies, her husband had said goodbye to her one day, and he had gone off to fight in this war that he didn't start, and he never came back. He died in battle. And another woman, her father, same story. Father went and fought and never came back. So these 2 women were in immense grief. The third thing I learned after getting there was that quite a few of the people in this group I was speaking to were not Christians. They were interested in the story of Jesus, but they weren't exactly sure if they were ready to commit to that worldview. They're wondering, is this really worth it? So what would you say to a group of people like that? I really had to think about that. What would I say to someone who just lost a family member? How could I tell that person that, well, God's good and Jesus matters and you should follow him? Could I honestly say that if you had been following Jesus, your husband would not have died? No, I can't say that. That's not true. There's a really good chance that if these people had been full-out, devout followers of Jesus, that the people they loved still would have died. So how do you explain that to people like this? One of the great perplexities of the Christian faith is the unpredictability of the outcomes of the followers. So for one person, they follow Jesus and it leads to joy and laughter and hope. And for another person, they follow Jesus and it leads to catastrophe and misfortune over and over again, and we can't predict it. So what do you think? What would you say to a friend that was wrestling with this? Or what would you say to some of these ladies that are struggling with this in Croatia? Or maybe for some of you, it's not what would you say to someone else. Maybe for some of you, it's like, yeah, this is your world. And you come to church today and you're like, I don't know. Like this, I'm wrestling with this. Like we're singing these songs and part of me is like, I don't even know if this is true. Like I don't even know if this matters. So how do you make sense of life when life doesn't really make any sense? So we're in a week 2 of this study of the book of Esther called Courage in Complexity. And it's a really helpful book in trying to figure out some of these deeper questions. And so last week where we left off was that Haman, the villain of the book, is wanting to kill all the Jews, and Esther's trying to summon the courage to go before the king to stop the plan. And so I'd like to pick up in the middle part of the story of Esther. So I will summarize parts of the story. We're in chapter 5, 6, and 7 of the book of Esther. And so Esther makes the right decision. She says, okay, I'm going to do it. I don't want to go before the king because I might die, but I'm still going to do it even though it's hard. So she goes before the king. The king extends his scepter and invites her to have audience with him. And she says, King, I'd like to invite you to a banquet, and I want Haman to come. So they go to a banquet. There's lots of banquets in this book, lots of eating. And at this banquet, Esther simply says, I'd like you to come to another banquet the next day. There's a lot of this, you kind of wait things out. She's really buttering up the royalty so she can make her pitch. Well, after this first banquet, we have two perspectives. We see what happens to Haman and we see what happens to Xerxes. So Haman leaves the banquet. He goes out in the streets and he sees Mordecai again. Mordecai's not bowing down again, which infuriates Haman yet again, that I'm honored by the queen, and yet I'm insulted by this Jew. And so he goes home and he's mad. And he tells his wife about it. He tells his friends about it. And this is a great line in the book. Chapter 5, verse 14. Here's their advice to Mordecai, or to Haman. Have gallows built and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai hanged on it. Like, it's just so irrational. Like, I'm so thankful that whenever some of you get irritated with something that I say, which happens, it's part of the job. The number of words I speak to, the number of people I speak to means that I'm going to get some things wrong. I'm just thankful that you don't respond the way that Haman's wife responded. So thank you for that. So this is Haman. He's mad. He has the gallows built. Meanwhile, Xerxes has some insomnia. In the middle of the night, he calls in some attendants, and they start reading some recent history. And they remind King Xerxes of a recent story where somebody saved the king's life, but Xerxes realizes he never thanked this person. And the person that he never thanked was, say it with me, Mordecai. Never thanked Mordecai. So then the sun starts to rise, and the king is thinking, how do I honor Mordecai for saving my life? And at that precise moment, Haman comes into the room, and the one thought on his mind is, how do I ensure that Mordecai dies? And so here's one of the great ironic passages in the book of Esther. We're now in chapter 6, verse 6. When Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? So he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. This is so over the top. It's almost like he's saying, yes, I'd like to go to Disney World and sleep in Cinderella's castle. Like he's just lathering this on. Verse 9, and lead him on the horse throughout the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Verse 10, the king says, do just as you have suggested for Mordecai. So Haman's devastated, so sad. So he goes out and he follows the orders. He parades Mordecai throughout the city. Well, then we get to the climax of the book, Banquet 2, the next day. Xerxes is there. Haman is there. And Esther says this in chapter 7, verse 3. If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. So if we talked about this last week. King doesn't know Esther's a Jew. Haman doesn't know Esther's a Jew. Verse 4, for I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Where is he? The man who has dared to do such a thing. Esther said, an adversary and enemy, this vile Haman. And so then Haman gets hanged on the gallows that he had built for Mordecai. So such an intriguing story. Bob Carpenter was telling me last week that in college, Bob Carpenter is one of our shepherds, and in college he got to go to a study of, there was a group of Orthodox Jews which were celebrating Purim, which is actually the festival that this book leads to. And he said that their tradition, at least this family that he got to be with, they would read the whole story of Esther out loud every year during Purim. And I love the image of this. every time Haman came into the story, all the people that were listening to the story would boo and hiss in this collective reading of the story. So you can just imagine Jews doing that. So here's the question I want to reflect on for just a minute. How is God working in this story? It's a strange, complicated story. God's name is not mentioned, and yet God is clearly at work. It's very similar to your life and my life, where sometimes we're not sure exactly what God's doing, where he's working, what he might be trying to say to us. It's confusing sometimes. So let's start here. Let's put 4 characters in our mind's eye on the stage and ask, what does each character want? So let's start with Esther. What exactly does Esther want? She won the beauty pageant. She became queen. She doesn't want to die. And she does want to save her people. That's what she wants. Xerxes, well, he's just learned that he forgot to thank Mordecai, so he wants to thank him. He's also just learned that his right-hand man has manipulated the king to sign a decree to kill all the Jews, so he's pretty upset about that, and he would like to deal with Haman, and then he wants to protect his queen. So he wants to thank Mordecai, he wants to execute Haman, he wants to protect his queen. Mordecai, what does Mordecai want? Mordecai knows that Esther rose to this position for such a time as this. He knows that she has some influence and that maybe she can make a difference, and he knows that he needs to play a part in inspiring her. So he really just wants to give Esther courage. And then Haman, well, he's the classic golden boy, born on third base, thinks he hit a triple. He just wants to gain power. He's all in it for himself. He wants to kill the Jews and gain power. So everybody wants something a little bit different. And so one question to think about is, does any character's desire 100% reflect the desires of God himself? Well, no, they don't. In fact, there's a lot that we can learn about desire from this book. And so here's one point I'd like to make. The intensity of a desire does not guarantee the integrity of a desire. So all day long, you and I, we live our days, we live our weeks, basically desire to desire. We just want things. And some things we want them really badly. But just because you want something really, really, really bad doesn't make it really, really, really good. So, for example, some of you are really irritated with a coworker right now, and you really want that coworker to fail this week because you're bitter or you're jealous because of something he did or something she said, and so you want that deeply right now. Well, that doesn't make your desire full of integrity and goodness. It's just a desire. Some of you really badly want to date a specific guy or a specific girl, or maybe you want to marry a specific guy or a specific girl. David wanted to get together with Bathsheba. So the intensity of a desire, just because you want it really, really bad, doesn't mean it's a good desire. Some of you want your social media following to increase by thousands and thousands of people. Doesn't necessarily make it a good thing. So be really careful when you're analyzing your own desires. Just because you feel something really intensely doesn't necessarily mean that that is a really good thing. Now let's talk about God's desires. What does God want in this story? Well, there's a lot behind the scenes going on, and in fact, the thing I'm about to share with you is one of my favorite parts of the Bible that I've studied, where so many parts of the Bible come together. There's so much going on in this story that we don't notice. So there's a group of people called the Amalekites. They first come into the Bible in Genesis 14. And then throughout the Old Testament, they actually come up over and over and over again, and they're the most consistent thorn in Israel's flesh. So they're always preying upon the weak and the vulnerable in Israel. So for example, Deuteronomy 25:17, remember what the Amalekites did to you along the way when you came out of Egypt. When you were weary and worn out, they met you on your journey and attacked all who were lagging behind. So this is who the Amalekites were. They would prey upon the weak and the vulnerable and the aged and the children. We read this in Numbers chapter 14. The Amalekites came down and attacked them and beat them all the way down to Horem. Judges 6, whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Amalekites invaded the country. They came up like a swarm of locusts. They invaded the land to ravage it. So they're a pest. I mean, Israelites are just planting corn. And the Amalekites come and they destroy the crops. So all throughout the Old Testament, the Amalekites just keep showing up. And God tells Israel over and over, wipe these people out. In fact, some of the passages that we read when God tells them to wipe them out, they're kind of uncomfortable. They're the passages where like, are you sure you meant that, God? That's really strong language. Why would you tell the Israelites to wipe this entire group of people out? And yet God keeps telling them, you need Israel to get rid of the Amalekites. In fact, one very famous story in 1 Samuel chapter 15, God tells Saul to destroy the Amalekites, and he partially does. In fact, most of the times in the Old Testament when God commands this, Israel either ignores it or they don't do it fully. And so in this case, in 1 Samuel 15, Saul does wipe out some of the Amalekites, but not all of them. In fact, he spares the king, King Agag. So that's about 1000 BC when that happens. So fast forward 500 years, now we're 500 BC, story of Esther. Haman comes onto the scene, and there's a really interesting descriptor about who Haman was. We read it in Esther chapter 3, verse 1. Haman the Agagite. In other words, Haman had descended from King Agag. And so, if Saul had done what God wanted Saul to do 500 years ago, there would never have been a Haman. And so Haman was really just the last iteration of these dark, malevolent forces manifested through pagan nations which had been trying to subvert the intentions of God's people for thousands of years. All the way back to the beginning, really. It's like we're stuck in Esther thinking about, well, what exactly is God doing here? Well, again, Haman comes from Agag 500 years later, which is part of the group of people, the Amalekites, which you can trace back through Judges and through Numbers all the way back to Genesis 14, which ironically is the first chapter in the Bible in which we are introduced to the concept of war, which then is pretty closely paralleled with, if you go back just a little bit further to Genesis 11, where we find the Tower of Babel and people are now divided, which is then correlated to Genesis 3, where you find the enemy of God trying to unravel God's good creation. So what exactly does God want in this story? This is not simply about just saving the Jews of the day. This is not just simply about giving Esther a little bit of courage so she can get through her anxious time. No, the story of Esther, when you really zoom out and look at the whole story of the Bible, the story of Esther is about God, yet again, pushing against the dark powers and forces which have been plaguing his good creation since the Garden of Eden. And so the story of Esther is about God wanting to bring about new creation, his new purposes. He wants to bring about restoration for his people. So it's a lot bigger than we would normally think when we're just reading through the book. And so one thing that I think is really important to acknowledge is that when we don't fully understand what's going on, like when God doesn't answer your prayers the way that you want him to, or when something happens in your life and you just can't explain it, like why did this happen like this? Why would God do this? Sometimes we simply have to acknowledge that God knows more, like infinitely more than we know. Like we get this with children and good fathers. Sometimes good fathers just know more than the children do, and so the father makes a choice that the child doesn't understand, but that's still better for the child. Well, if good fathers can do that, don't you think that our good Father could do that? Sometimes it's simply a matter that we just don't know as much as God knows. My daughter Anna, the last few years, she's always loved to read, but she's been writing more. And so she's written a few of these kid novels. Well, the other day I asked her, I said, well, what book are you working on now? And she said, well, I'm working on book 5 in this series. And she doesn't like to tell us a lot of what it's about because she likes us to read the books together as a family. Well, a few weeks later, she was typing at her computer on a story, and I said, well, how are you doing today? What story are you working on today? And she said, I'm working on book 4. And I said, well, I thought a few weeks ago you were working on book 5. And she says, well, I was working on book 5, but I realized that some of the things that I want to happen in book 5 with some characters and plot twist or something, I realized that if I want that to happen in book 5, I actually need to go back and rewrite part of the book of book 4. And I said, oh, that's interesting. Well, if a human being, a teenager, is capable of understanding different parts of the story at the same time, and if she's capable of going into one section of the book 4 because she knows what she wants to happen in book 5, don't you think that God is even more capable of doing that? In fact, in the book of Hebrews, one of the descriptors that we find for God is he's author. Like he's the author of life. And it's a really helpful way to think about who God is. And if God is author, really think about this. If God's author, then he really does know everything. Like he knows the beginning and the end of every person, of every business, of every family, of every church, of every nation. He just knows it through and through. He knows every act of betrayal, every act of reconciliation before it happens. He sees every birth, every death, every triumph, every tragedy before these things even come onto the pages of human history. God already sees the shifts in culture that worry us so much before they happen. God knows the results of every election before the election even goes down. He sees all of it. He already knows the rise and fall of every leader, both before and after our time. And then thinking about the future, God already sees the culmination of the whole human drama. He sees the end of the story, the reconciliation of the whole cosmos. He sees it all because he's the author. And so the big difference between us and God is that we're the characters in the story and he's the author of the story. And so he does have the right to write it the way he wants to. And so here's really the invitation for you and for me. And this is so important. So dial in with me on this part. We are invited to trust, not to understand. And I know that if you're anything like me, I want to understand badly. Like it really troubles me when bad things happen with no explanation. And it really troubles me when really good people are following Jesus and doing the right thing and horrible things happen to these people. And then people that have no thought of God and they're doing these terrible things with their life and nothing happens to them. I mean, and the psalmist, he struggled with this too. Like, I want to understand, but I'm invited to trust. I have to trust that God knows more than me. So here's 2 practical takeaways from this lesson on Esther. The first one is this: play your role instead of questioning God's. It's really easy to question God. Sometimes we wonder why God would write one story this way and another story this way, or why would God not answer a prayer when we've prayed it for so many years? Or even when we read the Bible, sometimes we wonder, God, why didn't you respond this way? Or why do you put this terrible story in the middle of 1 Samuel 15 where you tell Saul to kill this group of people? Why? Like, it's so easy to question God. And yet one of the things that I've been reflecting on in my own life is that I've been reflecting on this idea of calling lately, and at least for me, I'm realizing God didn't call me to be a critic. He called me to be a disciple. And every minute that I spend critiquing what God is doing and questioning His actions and saying to Him, well, if I were you, I wouldn't have done it this way. Every minute that I spend questioning what God is doing is a minute I'm not engaged in ministry. I'm called to play my role, and I have to trust that God's going to play His role. In fact, back to the Croatia story, when I was getting up and pretty nervous, not knowing what to say to this group of people who's grieving and not even knowing if they believed in Jesus, it was amazing because God did something remarkable over those 4 days, specifically to this group of Ukrainians. However, the gospel moment that eventually came with these people didn't come because I facilitated it. It actually came from another person at the retreat. And so here I was all worried about, wow, this is a really critical moment, and I have an opportunity to speak this message of hope to these people that desperately need it, and what am I going to say? And I'm carefully rewriting my messages, trying to think, how do I talk to these people? And lo and behold, God uses someone else out of left field to tell these people the story of Jesus in a way that I simply couldn't tell. And there's a whole story to that as well, and I'm going to share that with you later this summer. But all that to say, I had to play my role, and I had to trust God that God was going to play His role. One final takeaway, pretty similar point, but a different angle. Here's something you can do with this message. Play your role instead of critiquing someone else's. We have become very, very good at observing the life of someone else and saying, yeah, he's an idiot. She's an idiot. They just need to do this or that. I can't believe she said this. If he would only do this. We are so good at critiquing the jobs of other people. I was at the Pepperdine Lectureships a few months ago, and I went to a class that one of my friends was teaching. His name's Joe Von Barrington, and the title of his class was How to Love Sundays. And so I thought, that sounds like a good class. I want to get better at enjoying Sundays. Sundays are work days. They're hard days. So I went to his class. And the point that he made that really stuck with me, he made a very simple point. He said, practice the posture of receiving rather than evaluation. And what he meant is that we get in the habit of becoming brilliant evaluators. We do it all the time. And we've lost the posture of just receiving what is. In fact, I was talking to Jovan a few weeks after the conference on the phone about this very notion of the relationship between receiving and evaluating, and it struck me that we're trained by our culture to be evaluators. Every time you take a flight, rent a car, go to a restaurant, you get that email a few days later and it says, tell us how we did. And over time, that forms us. And so now, that's all we want to do. We would just critique everything. Well, I mean, what question do we normally ask ourselves when we get in the car and we're driving home from church? We say, how was it today? And then we go into our evaluation. Well, I like this song, didn't like that song. The sermon was okay, went a little long. We evaluate everything. So what would it look like for you just to receive? You come to church not to evaluate, not to be a critic, not to figure out what's right and what's wrong, but just to receive. What might God have to offer me today? It'd be a totally different posture to engage church. It'd be a totally different posture to engage life. Play your role instead of critiquing somebody else's. What's your job? What's your role in God's kingdom? And imagine your life if you adopted this. Like if you could just launch out into your week focusing on what you could do for God rather than critiquing what everybody else was doing or not doing for God. Imagine how much better your life would get. Imagine the freedom that you would have with this kind of a posture. You would live your life this week with the beautiful truth that you can't save the world. You don't have to save the world. You don't have to save the church. You don't have to save the country, because God is perfectly capable of doing all those things. All He's called you to do is to play your role and to do it in love. If you bow with me in a word of prayer. Father, I want to be the first one to confess today that I often exceed what you have asked me to do. Too often I question you, and too often I critique others. And so, Father, I'm praying that you will release me from that need to be in control and enable me to simply live a life freely, playing my part in love. And Father, I pray that for everybody in the room. Help us identify what roles you've called us to play and help us to live them to the best of our ability, trusting that the world and the church is in the capable hands of you, our Father, who we know has the ability and the capacity to handle it. So we trust these things to you, Father. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. We're going to sing a simple song, powerful message, God will make a way. It's in your song books. It's not going to be on the screen. Did we say what song number it is yet? 116? 116. It's in your song books. We're going to sing this song. If you have any kind of a need that we can address publicly, whether that be prayer or baptism, we'd be happy to serve you today. You're welcome to come tell me about it. Let's stand and let's sing.